The Supreme Court has just issued what is a major ruling on the president's use of tariffs.
The president cannot rely on this 1977 emergency law to impose tariffs without authorization from Congress.
Trump is in full panic mode after the Supreme Court ruled his sweeping tariffs as illegal, detonating the very policy that he called the crown jewel of his presidency. In a brutal constitutional smackdown, the court tweaked his strategy, sending shockwaves through Washington and leaving the White House scrambling. Now the question is, what happens next when a $150 billion tariff empire collapses overnight?
Here, the Supreme Court ruling that President Trump's use of these emergency tariffs that he has implemented are illegal. It's the most significant economic case to reach the high court in years, sweeping implications for the economy and, of course, for presidential power. And at stake here are billions of dollars in revenue that have already been collected by the government.
A major slap at the President of the United States, who has made a major effort over these many, many months to impose all of these tariffs. And just to look at some of the background I have here, over these many months, the administration has collected $150 billion in these tariffs.
This is where everything flipped. Trump called these tariffs the single most important thing that he did as president. He built his comeback around them. He branded them. He defended them. He warned everyone that if the Supreme Court struck them down, we're screwed. Well, the court just struck them down. So what now?
Tony, this decision is 6-3, invalidating President Trump's use of these sweeping tariffs, imposing tariffs on almost every trading partner worldwide. This is the most significant U.S. Supreme loss for a U.S. president.
In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that his sweeping global tariffs were illegal, not questionable, not particularly flawed, illegal. And I don't think people fully understand how big that is. Legal analysts are calling this one of the most significant Supreme Court losses for a president in modern history. Now that's not dramatic language. That's the reality.
This question is really about the extent of presidential power. And we know in both his terms in office, President Trump has really worked at the edges of what has largely been recognized as executive authority.
And here's what makes this hit even harder. This came from a conservative majority court. Chief Justice John Roberts sided with the 3 liberal justices. That alone is major. But what really shocked Washington is that Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, both appointed by Trump, joined the majority. 2 of his own picks voted against him.
President Trump's appointees, Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Neil Gorsuch, joining the Chief Justice John Roberts and the 3 liberal justices to invalidate the use of these sweeping tariffs.
On the other side, Kavanaugh, Alito, and Thomas dissented, but the 6 votes were enough. The tariffs are now gone.
But based on our reading right now, it looks like this is all about looking at specific words like regulate and determining what that means for the power of any president, again, under this particular statute.
If you've been following this court, you know critics have accused it of being in the tank for Trump. This ruling just crushed that narrative. When it came to the core constitutional question, the majority, they didn't blink. And that question wasn't just about trade. It was about power.
There are 3 dissenters, led by another appointee, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, joined by Justice Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. But the bottom line, Tony, a major defeat for the president. I think you can put that right up there with some of the most significant Supreme Court losses by a U.S. president in history.
Trump relied on a 1977 law, the International Economic Emergencies Act, to justify these tariffs. That law was designed during the Cold War. It was used to freeze assets, impose sanctions, respond to foreign crises. For nearly 50 years, no president used it to slap tariffs on almost every trading partner on Earth.
The president has the power to impose these sweeping tariffs under this particular law. It looks like a lengthy, divided, and complicated opinion, but the bottom line is exactly what Jan said, which is the president does not have the power under this particular statute.
But Trump, he did. His administration argued that the global trade situation amounted to an economic emergency. They told the court that the statute gave the president broad authority, but the justices pushed back hard. Roberts wrote that the president was asserting extraordinary power of unlimited amount, duration, and scope. In simple terms, the court said if you want that kind of authority, Congress has to clearly give it to you. And Congress, they didn't.
Of the text of the statute, and because of the power that the Constitution gives to the president versus Congress, it looks like, based on our quick reading, that this is all about the idea that the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce.
The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce and impose taxes. Tariffs raise revenue. That's legislative power, not executive power. And that's where this really becomes explosive.
Congress the power to impose taxes. And that when we look at this particular statute, it does not look like a delegation of Congress's authority. Like, we have the power under the Constitution. Are we now going to ship that over to you, the president? And today the court says no. Obviously, it's a case with huge implications in terms of the economy, in terms of the power.
Because while this legal battle was unfolding, the administration was collecting money, a lot of it. Custom data shows at least $130 billion has already been taken in. Other estimates put it closer to about $150 billion. Now, that's not small change. That is massive.
So the end result, and we are still going through this, but the end result is that Donald Trump's tariffs have been struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. But really important point I want to make, Donald Trump has said, various White House officials have said, if he loses on this basis, he will try to re-implement other tariffs through other laws, which he can try to do.
And I keep coming back to this simple question. What happens to the money now? During oral arguments, Justice Barrett directly asked about refunds. What happens if these tariffs are ruled unlawful? Do businesses get their money back? Do they get interest? Does the government just keep it? We still don't have a clear answer, and that uncertainty is huge.
And not only the economic agenda, but arguably the foreign policy agenda as well, Tony, because the hope here at the White House at times was to be able to use the threat of tariffs as sort of a coercive tool to get their way with certain countries or certain parts of the world, most especially Europe.
More than 100 companies have already filed lawsuits challenging these tariffs. Small business owners were writing five-figure checks just to move goods through customs. One owner said that she had just paid $13,000 in tariff costs in a single week. Think about it. That's payroll money. That's expansion money. That is survival money.
The president has said, though, in recent weeks that were this to happen and the Supreme Court does not uphold his tariffs, quote, we're screwed. It would take many years to figure out what number we're talking about and even who, when, and where to pay back. The Trump administration's collected at least $130 billion in tariff revenue, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection reports out in recent days. And there will be businesses across this country now wondering, do I get my money back, and do I get it back with interest? More than 100 different companies of all sizes had filed suit, raising questions about the legality of these tariffs.
Trump didn't treat tariffs like a side policy. He treated them like a weapon, a negotiating tool, a show of strength. He used them to pressure trading partners, especially in Europe. He framed them as economic liberation. Now, the cornerstone of that strategy has been invalidated.
And the question now will be, does he perhaps try to seek tariffs or put them in place in other ways? There are ways, in fact, he could do that. We've seen him, for example, put tariffs on various sectors of the economy, like the semiconductor and manufacturing equipment that goes with them.
Yes, he has other options. There's Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act. Presidents can impose tariffs on specific sectors if national security is involved, such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and critical minerals. But those are narrower, slower, therefore much more limited. This ruling doesn't end the tariff conversation, but it absolutely ends the sweeping global approach under that 1977 emergency law.
It is invalidating what is the cornerstone of President Trump's economic policy, ruling that he does not have authority under this federal law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to levy these sweeping tariffs, like I said, on almost every global trading partner worldwide.
And I think what really stands out to me is this. A conservative Supreme Court just told a Republican president that he crossed a constitutional line. Now that doesn't happen casually. That almost never happens. This wasn't about personalities. It wasn't about party loyalty. It was about who holds the power to tax and regulate commerce in this country. The court drew a line and said that line belongs to Congress.
Pamela Wolf, the other significance here is that this is the first time that the 6-3 conservative court has ruled against President Trump in one of these major cases that have gone before the court since he returned to power in January.
Now we're left with the country watching what comes next. Will businesses get refunds? Will administrations pivot to narrower tariffs? Will this reshape the balance of executive power going forward? One thing is pretty clear. The tariffs that Trump built his identity around are now gone. And when a president loses $150 billion worth of policy in a single ruling, well, that's not just a legal defeat.
Now, we are still going through this case, but this is something we have been waiting for. The court said that it would take up this case on an expedited basis. So they're deciding, even though it's a significant case now, because of course this has enormous implications.
What it is a political earthquake. What made the scene even more striking was the contrast. On one side, business owners were cautiously celebrating and calling their accountants to ask about refunds. On the other side, the White House was quiet, carefully reviewing the decision. And that silence spoke volumes. This was not a minor setback. This was a structural blow to a policy that had been described as central to the administration's economic strategy.
Another outstanding question is what now happens to all that revenue that had been collected. This is something it really wasn't clear from the arguments what they would say about that, if they're going to lay out a plan. So we will continue to go through this, but this is an enormous decision and a rare loss for President Trump.
Public opinion had already been moving into this direction. 63% of Americans opposed the tariffs. That is a clear majority. People were looking at higher prices and asking whether this strategy was truly helping them. The administration framed the tariffs as leverage, even as a diplomatic cudgel, particularly in negotiations with Europe and other trading partners. The messaging was tough and confident. The argument was that this was strength in action, but voters were looking at their bills, not press conferences.
But in these arguments back in November, they went on for 2.5 hours. It was clear that the justices were skeptical that President Trump could rely on this vague federal law to impose global tariffs. Now, they did appear to likely be willing to decide that these were illegal, but what is not clear, we haven't gotten to this part of the opinion, is what happens to all that revenue that has been collected by the government.
This is also the moment when the narrative about the Supreme Court shifted. Critics have long argued that the conservative majority was aligned with the president's. Yet in this case, 2 of his own appointees joined the majority to invalidate the tariffs. When the justices examined the statute and the Constitution, well, they did not default to political loyalty. They drew a boundary, and that boundary was about institutional balance, not personality.
The tariffs Donald Trump announced back in April on Liberation Day are gone. They have been ruled illegal by this U.S. Supreme Court.
Politically, this ruling lands heavily because tariffs were described as the cornerstone of the administration's economic agenda. They were framed as a defining achievement and tied to the symbolism of Liberation Day. Losing this case weakens that narrative. Governors, business leaders, and foreign governments were all watching this decision closely. The global reaction reflects how central these tariffs have become in trade negotiations. Europe and other partners have been navigating under the threat of broad tariffs. That leverage tool is now limited. Markets reacted because the decision introduces both relief and uncertainty. Relief for businesses that felt squeezed, but uncertainty about what comes next. America's trade posture has shifted in a single ruling. The legal fight over this specific strategy may be over, but the broader debate about trade and executive power, well, it's not.
An interesting array of justices here. In the majority, ruling that the tariffs are illegal is Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, three conservatives who teamed up with the three liberal justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, to rule these tariffs unconstitutional. The dissenters are Justices Thomas, Alito, and Kavanaugh.
What stands out most is the convergence of forces. Small businesses expressing relief, a majority of the public opposing the policy, a conservative Supreme Court drawing a constitutional line, and a president facing the collapse of a policy that he considered central to his legacy. That combination does not happen often.
And the basis for the ruling is this: Congress, not the president, Congress typically holds the tariff power. Now, Congress passed this law back in 1977 called the International Economic Emergencies Act. And Donald Trump tried to use that law to say, well, I'm declaring an international economic emergency, therefore I'm imposing tariffs.
This moment is not just about tariffs. It is about how far presidential power can extend without explicit congressional approval. It is about who controls the economic levers in peacetime. And it is about how policies that sound strong on paper feel very different when they show up on receipts.
Majority here said, no, that law does not authorize you to impose tariffs, and no, there is not a valid international economic emergency here.
The sweeping global approach under that 1977 emergency law is now over. What replaces it will likely be narrower and more carefully justified. For now, the global hammer has been set down, and the country is watching to see whether the next move is bold again or far more measured. This actually felt like a constitutional showdown. Trump has always governed by pushing executive power to its edge. But this time, the court drew a hard line. The justices rejected what they called transformational expansion of presidential tariff authority, and they reminded everyone that revenue powers were originally designed for Congress. And honestly, this ruling may not just limit Trump. It could restrain future presidents too. Now the chaos question kicks in. Do tariffs stop immediately? Are importers still being charged? Does this head back to lower courts? How fast can Treasury unwind billions? The legal fight may be over, but the financial war, well, it's just beginning.